It's Sarah here. If you're new to the channel, welcome. Today we are going to be putting the garden to bed and planting some garlic. It's been cold here lately. I'm in, hi ladies! South Central Wisconsin. I live in zone 5A. And so, hi ladies! It's been pretty cold here already. I haven't had a chance to put the garden to bed yet. Come here. This is Edna. Edna, say hi. Hi, girl. All right. I had a chance to take care of this because it's been so cold, and then we had a lot of rain. So that's what we're just gonna do today. So I like to start out by going down the rows and raking out the pine needles that are mixed in there with the leaves that have fallen off of our maple tree. We have a lot of pine trees that surround us, and so we have an abundance of pine needles every year that land in the garden, and if they're left, they can make the soil very acidic, and we end up with difficult growing conditions as a result. On this day, it was so beautiful out and warm. In the start of our warm weather again, we had another warm weather streak here that I decided to let the chickens out to free range. We like to do that whenever we're working out in the yard. We have a lot of aerial predators, so they don't always get to do that otherwise. And so while I was working, then I began to untie any of the plants that I had tied onto the twine, just to make sure that that gets out of the garden. And then I went along and I just clipped all of the plants right at the base by the ground to remove them and leave the root system intact in the ground to just compost in place. It will just add some organic matter into the ground. And then I took those plants and I am going to just put them in my compost this year instead of just leaving them in place on the ground. Sometimes tomatoes can get disease on them, and you wouldn't want to leave that in the garden because you can add that disease into your soil then. And you honestly wouldn't want to add that to your compost either if you had diseased plants during the growing season, because you will just contaminate your soil and you would want to burn those instead. I did not have any disease this year. This was just a personal choice that I made to add it to our compost bin because I did not have a lot in there to make compost for this coming spring. Next, I started to untie this wire that I have attached to these T-posts. During the growing season, some of my twine broke that was holding up our tomato plants, and so I had to quick come up with a solution. I don't think that I will use wire or twine again next year between the T-posts. I might just use a cattle panel instead. It'll be a lot more sturdy and provide more support. And honestly, I haven't decided how I'm going to plant the garden next year, and I might not include tomatoes in this garden at all. I might include the tomatoes in a plot that I have elsewhere. In addition to the tomatoes, I had also planted tomatillos and peppers in this garden, which did less wonderfully than I had hoped for. At this point then, I could hear some crows in the area, and I realized that a hawk was in the area, so I moved the girls back into their coop. We've had a red-tailed hawk family that has lived in one of our trees before, and so aerial predators are a real threat for my chickens. I began to wrap things up by removing the tomato cages that I had holding up the tomatillos and removing the last bit of plants and putting them in a pile to the side to later take to the compost bin. I'm then going to go through and do a nice rake of the area to get up any of those last bit of pine needles that I may have missed, and really expose any weeds that I have in the garden so that I can go through and pick those weeds and get them out of the garden now while they're young before I go ahead and start to cover them. The last thing that we would want to do is leave this garden bed exposed like this. It becomes a great place for weed seeds to make a home, and come springtime, the garden will be overrun with weeds. Last year, I didn't cover the garden like I should have. I was sick at that time, and so come spring this past season, I had a ton of stinging nettle that popped up in my garden in the beginning, and it was not fun to deal with. I don't know if you've ever accidentally brushed up against stinging nettle, but it is not the nicest feeling. It honestly reminds me of having like little shards of glass in your fingers or in your hand. I continue to pick the weeds out of this bed before moving to the front yard, where we have a very large maple tree. We don't have any pine trees in the front yard, so I like to rake the leaves in the front yard because I know that the majority of what I'm getting is just purely leaves and not pine needles. I don't want to make the soil acidic because I have spent years trying to heal the soil from all the acidity. It was so much that nothing would really grow in it. And so I use the leaves to add to the garden to cover it for winter time, and those will break down during the winter and compost right in place, adding organic matter to the garden while also providing a cover from weed seeds. And before winter officially arrives here, I will then clean the chicken coop out one more time and apply the coop clean out on top of these leaves to break down over winter as well. During the growing season, you wouldn't want to add that chicken clean out right into the garden because that would be what we call hot compost, and it could burn your plants and actually kill them. So you would want it to sit and break down with the other matter in your compost pile before adding it later on. In this situation, though, this will be sitting for months, breaking down while other stuff isn't growing in there, and so that isn't a concern. And by springtime, it would be cool. The chicken clean out will add much needed nitrogen back into the soil. And if you aren't doing this step that I am, if you don't have chickens or something, then in the springtime when you plant, you can add an all-purpose fertilizer into each hole as you plant your plants or overall on top of your garden. I think I ended up adding 3 overflowing wheelbarrow fulls of leaves to this garden. For the time being, I was just putting these leaves on the right-hand side of this garden, leaving the left side open so that I can plant the garlic. The garlic variety that I chose is Nootka Rose, and it's an heirloom variety, and it adapts well to most areas. It's considered a soft neck garlic, and they usually have more cloves per head, between 8 to 20. And while peeling is a bit more difficult with this variety of garlic, the soft neck, it has its benefit because it is a much longer storage life, and it can last sometimes, around up to around 9 months in storage if you store it correctly. The soft neck garlic tend to thrive better in warmer climates, but it can still be grown in cooler ones like mine. It just requires a little more work to protect it, and this is why we are planting it about 4 inches deep, and we're going to add a good thick layer of leaves on top. There's also hardneck garlic, and those generally produce between 4 to 12 cloves per head, and they're more easy to peel and is hardier in colder climates. The storage for hardneck garlic can be around 5 months, though, when properly cured and stored, so it's much less. When planting the garlic, we want to put the pointy side up and the root side down. So we just dig a hole for my area in this variety, about 4 inches down, put it in, and then just loosely cover it again. And you don't need to peel the paper off of it or anything like that. The spacing for your garlic cloves should be about 6 inches apart. Now, my space is a little more limited, and so I like to do high intensity gardening. So I space my plants a little closer together. And for the cloves, that would be, 4 to 5 inches apart. And as a result of that, I may end up with just, a little smaller sized heads of garlic, but I'm able to plant much more by doing a high intensity method. I got this garlic into the ground the end of October, about the last week of October. I would normally want to put it in the ground mid-October. You just want to be able to have it in the ground early enough that it can kind of take hold in the ground with warm weather, not, put it in the ground and immediately have a cold spell. You want it to kind of develop a root system a little bit before winter arrives. And while I was a little late getting it into the ground than I would have liked, we did have really beautiful weather then the next week, with the weather being in the 70s, which is abnormal for Wisconsin, the last week of October, first week of November. But it worked out well. In the springtime, then, this will come up and it'll start growing, and we will end up harvesting this garlic sometime in July when the plants turn about 50% yellow and start dying back. Then that will be the clue to us that it's time to harvest. But we want to make sure that about 50% of it is yellow before we go ahead and do that. Like I had said earlier, this is the Nootka Rose variety, and it's a soft neck variety, and so it's not going to bolt, but hardneck garlic bolts, and a hardneck garlic will produce a stem that can be seen going down through the center of the bulb of cloves, and this stem that comes out will produce a flower, which is called a scape. And scapes can be cut off while they're still tender and eaten. So if you're growing garlic and you're not sure which variety you planted, that's one way that you can tell in the summer when you harvest your garlic. That's one way that you can tell whether you planted a hardneck variety or a softneck variety. When you crack that bulb open, you will see that stem had gone down and protruded into the bulb through the center. And if that is there, then you have grown a hardneck variety. And if it's not, then you grew a softneck. The hardneck cloves will also be much larger than the cloves on a softneck variety. And the softneck garlic varieties tend to lend themselves to a less pungent flavor than the hardneck garlic. The hardneck varieties can have a more complex flavor and have been known to be compared to a wild garlic. After planting, then I just raked the leaves that I had dumped on the other side and just made a nice even layer across the garden bed, making sure to cover up that garlic and get a good couple inches of leaves on top of that to help protect it during our winter. We've been known to have some pretty harsh winters, and so we just want to make sure that we cover that really well so that it makes it through the winter. After I cover the remainder of the garden with the leaves, I go ahead and pick up all those tomato plants, tomatillo pepper plants that I had cut out of the garden earlier. And I don't show that on camera, but I go over and I stick it into our compost bin. It's a compost bin that I built a few years ago. It's just a square with some slats that I can remove off of the front so I can take the wheelbarrow in there and dump stuff into there. It's about 4 feet by 4 feet. And every fall, I usually will take most of my plants out of the garden and pile them in there. I then, after taking the leaves from the front yard and putting them on the garden beds, whatever the remainder leaves that I have, I like to put those in the compost as well. And I'm usually able to fill it up to the top, and come spring, there is really no sign of leaves in there. It just compacts and breaks down so well. While I was out here, I took the time to just come over to the little bed that I have where I grow green beans, and I had left a bunch on the plants to dry out, and I just pick the pods that have dried up so far, and I will use these for next year to grow green beans. I'll just shell these pods and take the beans out and put those into a baggie, and those will be what I use to grow green beans next year. All of these plants in the green bean bed have not quite died all the way yet, and there's still some green on the green beans. Not all of them are totally dried out, so I just leave these for now to let them continue to dry so that I'm able to collect more. But when the time comes where those plants have died back, I will just snip those and leave those right there and cover them with a good layer of leaves, just like I did in the larger bed.
All right, that's it for today. Thanks for hanging out with me today, friends. I hope you learned something from this video. I feel really great that we were able to put one of my largest garden beds to bed today. That has been a task that I have needed to get to, and I'm so glad that it's done. See you next time.